Howdy, I'm Jammer. So, before we begin, as always, please remember that I have begun a Patreon account. It is designed to help fund this particular YouTube channel, as well as the art that I do outside of the channel. There is a link in the description section below to my link tree, and it will have a link directly to my Patreon account. $1 a month. That's all I ask. I don't have any other tiers. It's just $1 a month because you like the channel, you like me, you like my art, you want to support what I'm doing. And if you do, thank you. I tremendously appreciate you. So, obviously by now, you have probably been able to determine it's kind of dark. And in fact, by the time I'm recording this video, it's actually about 9 p.m. I thought it would be kind of interesting to do a video kind of like in the dark like this, because if the, small mountain of literature to my right is no indication enough, as well as, the title of the video itself, today's video is going to be about Junji Ito. And we've talked about Junji Ito before, specifically this book here, Amina, as well as me mentioning over and over and over again that at some point I'm going to be talking about Uzumaki Tomie Gyo, and just about everything Junji Ito has ever written, or ever will write. And in fact, I mean to hold to that promise too, because today's video, of course, is about Drifting Classroom. Now, when we talk about Junji Ito, it's, again, really important to recognize that we're going to be talking about horror comics. I mean, well, duh. But, again, when we talk about horror as a genre of art, as a genre of narrative, there are certain expectations that we go into the story. And especially when we're talking about a figure like Junji Ito, we have a man whose great body of work is a really interesting exploration of psychosis as well as the supernatural. While there are some horror authors who try to sort of pick one or the other and stick with it, at the same time, one of the most interesting things about the genre of horror is about the way it can kind of challenge our perception of reality. Oh, hello. And how things can suddenly just sort of, come to be. When we're talking about Drifting Classroom, this book, apart from really not feeling so much like one solid work, but I'll talk about that in a second, is really more than anything else a nice series of small tales that are designed to sort of explore an element of natural phenomena taken to a kind of hyperbolic degree. That's all a fancy pants way of saying this is a weird little book. And like most of the great body of Junji Ito's work, it's a great exploration of the genre of horror and what is possible with it. Again, I've said it before when I pointed out my video about Ramina, but the thing I like about Junji Ito's art, apart from just his gorgeous visual style, is his ability to just sort of take an idea and effectively run with it. And while at times his work can come across as accidentally comedic, at its core, it's still a really great exploration of what is possible with the genre of horror. So I kind of feel like I'm talking in a circle now, but when we're talking about Drifting Classroom, it's important, again, to recognize, looking at this, that this is a story that is going to be kind of at first like a science fiction story. We're going to run with a sort of central concept and then just kind of explore it out. But at the same time, one of the fun things about horror is that it allows us to explore those aspects of reality that we would prefer not recognize, which can be sadism in whatever form it manifests. It can be about the ways that we don't like to explore concepts of death and its inevitability, or that far more unfortunate reality, which is that not everybody dies in a very pleasant fashion. And so, looking at Drifting Classroom, I thought it was another fun opportunity to talk about a great horror comic, and again, gush about Junji Ito, because I freaking love the guy. So, I've done enough yammering. Let's talk about Drifting Classroom and why I think it's worth your time. Okay. One of these days, I'm going to have like an introduction to one of these videos that's going to be like a clear, concise sort of exploration of the actual topic on hand and not just me kind of just pontificating randomly into the camera. At least I like to think that's what it's going to be one day. But hey, you know what? Whatever. Let's talk about Drifting Classroom. Now, again, when we're talking about this book, as I noted before, this is a little bit difficult to describe. You have, in terms of the great body of work by Junji Ito, a kind of either or when it comes to the kind of material he releases. It's either usually long form books like Uzumaki, Gyo, or Tomie, where you have one central story that's spread out over a very long period. Then, on the other hand, you have books like this, Fragments of Horrors, and then a whole host of other short story collections that I haven't gotten around to actually buying up yet, but have every intention to because just beautiful. But this is to say that Junji Ito's work is typically broken down into long stories or short stories, which is pretty common for most writers, period, or generally most artists who employ some manner of writing in their mediums. But one of the things that to me is really interesting about Junji Ito as an author is that even his longer stories, Drifting Classroom included, is that even though this story is written much in the vein of, say, Uzumaki or Tomie, or even Ramina, Drifting Classroom is really another opportunity to really explore the fact that Junji Ito is more of a short story writer. Or maybe put another way, his work is really best when he takes small, short little explorations of stories and just kind of runs with it. Now, the central narrative of Drifting Classroom, if you can really call it, is that it follows these two protagonists that you see here at the very beginning. We have a young man, a teenager by the name of Yuma, and again, as always, my pronunciation is garbage. I got like a month of Japanese training before my friend actually moved back to Japan, the one who was teaching me Japanese, if you actually, pay attention to me in my life. Anyway, I have a month of Japanese under my belt, so if I mispronounce names, please, please, please forgive me. But you have Yuma, who is kind of an interesting guy, and then his sister Shizumi. And if you can't tell already, they're kind of weird. Now, I'm going to probably, for this video, just kind of focus on the first story for the most part to kind of show what Junji Ito is doing formally in this particular book. But then also, once you read one of these stories, you've got the general gist of what he's going to do throughout the rest of the story. And also, too, if you want to know what happens, go to your local comic book shop or your local library. Get yourself a copy. Anyway, the story begins in a high school with the introduction of Yuma. Again, there's not a lot of, or there isn't an extended sequence up to this. Junji Ito is really good most of the time of just dropping you right into the action itself. I mean, the first panel is literally just the exterior of a school, and then suddenly, boom, Yuma is being introduced to the class at large. And you can kind of tell, even in this paltry lighting here that I've given myself, right off the bat, Junji Ito establishes a visual tone. Now again, Ito is a horror manga artist. He's a horror writer, so naturally, tone is going to be absolutely everything. But one of the things that I really appreciate about Ito is that while there are some horror authors who like to take their time building up the dramatic tension and building up the atmosphere to, create a sense of paranoia in the viewer or the reader or what have you, Ito doesn't usually do that. He's kind of good about throwing it right at you. Now, you can argue both ways that this can kind of take you out of the story immediately, or at the very least, make you aware of what he's trying to do. And, I mean, again, clearly, I've read enough of the man's work to recognize what he's trying to do. But the first time you ever read a Junji Ito book, it hits you really hard. And I think one of the reasons for that is very simple. He knows how to use line work and shading techniques, not just in terms of physical anatomy, but then just in terms of atmospheres overall to really give you a sense of foreboding. If you look at this shot right here, it's just this young man in front of the classroom. And if you look at the setting overall, it's just that. We have the blackboard, we have the classroom, we have the desks, we have the students and the teachers. There's nothing terribly horrific or unsettling about the atmospheres. until there is. Because again, he knows what he's doing. He's throwing you right at the incident, right off. Or excuse me, he's throwing you right into the midst of it. Yuma is weird and strange, and at his very opening lines, he apologizes. This is something that Yuma is going to do throughout every single story. In fact, almost every single page of this book. We learn very quickly that people are laughing at him because they're like, what is he apologizing for? At first, he just seems like a very socially awkward, weird outsider who's just being extra goofy or extra funny. And people are like, what a weirdo. And then he keeps doing it. Now, alongside Yuma, this first story involves a woman by the name of Keiko. Now, Keiko is going to appear at the very tail end of the book as well. So this is, again, one of these instances where at first it seems like this is just going to be a loose series of stories, but the fact that you have these reoccurring characters lets you know that, no, we're following one quasi-central narrative. Now, okay, I've said already the setup now of Yuma is apologizing. He's constantly apologizing. But before I continue, I really want you, and here again, I probably shouldn't have turned off the lights, but I think you can still kind of see right here. Do you see these small faint lines and these faint lines here as well? You can also tell by the teacher's posturing and then the way the body language of these students as well. We have this nice long quasi-half-page panel, which is kind of swallowing up the action, but it's bringing all this dramatic flair and moment to his apology. And really think about this for a second. It's an apology. He's apologizing for... Actually, what is he apologizing for? Nothing. He hasn't done anything. This is literally page 1, and he hasn't done anything. So why is he apologizing? Again, we don't know. We do eventually figure out throughout the rest of the story, and in fact, if I might progress forward, the introduction of the second character, Yuma's little sister Chizumi, which is in typical Junji Ito fashion, terrifying as fudge. But we have the introduction of this character by the name of Chizumi, who we discover is Yuma's little sister. Now, again, we're told that she is his little sister, and she most likely is. Let's be real. She probably is. If you take the time to read this book, you're like, yeah, I buy it. But at the same time, what's so unsettling and bizarre about each of these characters is you kind of get the vibe after a while that there's nothing really familial about them. There's not really a real brother-sister relationship, or there isn't anything in the way of any kind of real love. What you begin to discover very quickly about Yuma and Chizumi is they're parasites, but their parasitism is rather unique. Yuma is constantly apologizing, constantly trying to make himself the sole focus of everything. And as you learn from Chizumi's behavior, she is incredibly antisocial. She relishes in being antisocial by freaking people out, by disturbing them, chasing them, in some instances biting them or hurting them outright. And at first, Chizumi's, well, just charming character seems a direct contrast to Yuma and almost seems at first like this is going to make him a very sympathizable figure. Until it isn't. And just a reminder, for those of you who are fans of the channel or have never been here before, I don't care about spoilers. I really don't. So when I talk about stories, I talk about the endings. So if you have not read Drifting Classroom and you want to read it, stop the video. In fact, stop the video right now. We'll wait. We'll wait. Okay, you gone? All right. So what we eventually learn from Chizumi herself is that Yuma is a very disturbed human being. Now, at first, Yuma himself tries to sort of explain his little sister's oddity, at least a little bit to some extent, by confiding in Keiko that at one point he began to sacrifice small animals, that he was sort of constantly overwhelmed with guilt, and this was kind of his way of trying to account for his little sister's oddity. And at first, it seems like a believable story until Chizumi eventually reveals that Yuma's behavior was not out of any sort of guilt complex. In fact, in a later sequence, when Chizumi lures Keiko into, their actual home, and then, confronts her in, again, gorgeous Junji Ito fashion, she has a little section here where she elaborates it further, saying, he's completely hopeless. It's because he killed so many snakes and frogs when he was little. And she's like, I know it's because he was so stressed because your parents were harsh, but he regrets it now. Please forgive him. Stress? I'm not going to try to sound cool at all. Just, yeah. Don't make me laugh. He didn't kill those animals out of stress. It was for the ritual. And Kyoko says, ritual? To which she says, yes, he was sacrificing them to the devil. Up in the hills outside of town, he was trying to summon the devil, and it worked. It's totally true. One day he came back from the hills shivering all the way, and then he groaned in his sleep all night long. That was the proof he'd met the devil. And you'll note that as he's lying under his bedsheets, he keeps saying, I'm sorry, I'm sorry, I'm sorry. And then in this panel here, but not to apologize to anyone in front of him, he prays to the devil for forgiveness. And then the apologies began to be accompanied by the most exquisite pleasure. So, before I discuss the formal aspects of it, this is, again, at least to my mind, one of the things I really like about horror overall. Because one of the best things about the genre is the way it manages to really confront people about our behaviors, particularly the way that human beings sort of establish modes of behavior that are supposedly good and evil. Now, before anybody tries to assume that this is going to be some sort of long lecture about morality, what have you, I do believe, personally, that there are things that most people agree are really fucked up and shouldn't be done. Murder. Rape. I mean, those are the two big ones, but maybe then also after the other ones, there's stuff like torture, but I kind of feel like, that's kind of implied. In fact, if I may be so bold, without, breaking into a long ethical conversation, there is probably, for the most part, a genuine general understanding of virtue in most human beings. There are things that we understand that you don't want to do because you have empathy for your fellow human beings. Horror asks the question, what if certain individuals lacked that empathy? And what can potentially happen when those individuals who lack that empathy interact with people who do? To wit, we have these two charming individuals, Yuma and Chizumi, his little sister, Chizumi, sorry. Yes, Yuma and Chizumi, who basically go about the land of Japan interacting with common, average, everyday people like Keiko, and wind up virtually destroying them. Now, before I sort of spiral out into a long-form narrative, what's important here is ultimately that Junji Ito really manages in this book, at least in my opinion, to really explore the way that empathy can be kind of twisted and contorted against people who ultimately have it. Because the problem here is, at this moment, we no longer feel sympathy, or at least I don't feel sympathy for Yuma and Chizumi, because they're revealed as, well, sadists. They're people who like to relish in pain. One may be a little more subtle with it than the other one, but nevertheless, they're figures who are ultimately defined by their antisocial behavior. Now, before I completely break away from it, I really do want to show you again these gorgeous pages. For me, the appeal of Junji Ito is his line work, and you need only look at these panels right here and the way he draws those sort of shadows around Chizumi's eyes. This is a common trick that he employed in Romina and that he has employed in just about every single one of his books, and it's an effective visual metaphor. The shadowing effect around the eyes, apart from making me think of every emo band I listened to in the early aughts, is also a really interesting opportunity to sort of observe how he's creating a visual metaphor. The shadow effect around of eyes in a Junji Ito novel, or graphic novel, is his way of sort of conveying either fear, paranoia, or really, the best way I can describe it is it's pushing into that realm in which reality is beginning to shift. Because again, up to this point, you'll note that the representation of most human beings in the story is pretty straightforward. If we look at the way that he's drawing the human body and representing it, there's nothing really, bizarre about it. It's the introduction of Chizumi, in this panel in particular, that we really at this moment begin to perceive that the world that we know is really beginning to melt away. Yuma's weird apology at the very beginning of the story, the one with the bold, dramatic lines on the whole half-page panel, is interesting. But it's odd in a social sort of oddity. Why is he apologizing? That's just weird. But the moment we get to Chizumi and her introduction, and the way that her body contorts in the most weirdest damn ways, is the way that Junji Ito manages to really blend our perception of reality. And again, you can observe it in just about every single one of the books that he's written to date. The moment you begin to see those shadows around the eyes, it's effectively that the reader is being taken into that other world, that Ito landscape, in which the world that we think we know disappears, and we are instead cast into the lot of darkness and monsters. And then, far more importantly, that world begins to imprint itself more and more and more upon the world that we recognized before. This is, again, one of the reasons why I love Junji Ito, because there are some horror artists who try one way or the other, or they try to create a sort of alternate reality, and they fail miserably because they just don't really seem to understand that the real horror is recognizing when that reality is imprinting itself upon our own and we can't go back. Now, after the sort of confrontational scene between Keiko in Chizumi and Yuma's house, we learn something really, really important. Yuma is effectively Chizumi's only connection to the world, because, in most beautiful fashion, we discover the parents have long since passed away. But more important than the fact that they passed away is more the fact that Yuma apologized to them over and over and over again, like he's been doing to every single person in the story to date. Ew. But not just that. We learn, again from Chizumi, who one of the flaws of this book is the fact that she's more often than not there to provide some manner of exposition rather than just being there naturally. But if you observe from this stunning passage, is effectively what we learn is that Yuma's constant apology does something to the minds of the people that he's apologizing to. Specifically, it literally melts their goddamn brains. And this is where you move from just like, that's weird, that's creepy, that's spooky, that's fucked up, to that's ridiculous. And this is one of the fun parts to me about being a regular reader of Junji Ito, is that sometimes his work is really horrific and profoundly disturbing. And then other times, it's just bonkers and crazy and freaking hysterical. Like, as much as I hate to admit it, one of the effects of reading Drifting Classroom, like just any of his other books, is that there are times when I'm reading it, and I'm like, oh, no, I gotta put the book down, and I've gotta go I've gotta watch some Teletubbies or something to kind of cleanse the palate. And then, literally 5 pages later, I will be on the floor laughing. Because it's just so profoundly ridiculous. And again, a perfect example of this is the fact that while Chizumi is explaining to Keiko that her brains are melting because Yuma is apologizing to her and all of her student classmates, if we look on the previous page, wait, where'd it go? You'll see Keiko walks into the classroom, observes Yuma being tormented by a whole bunch of bullies, apologizing, and then they turn around and things get weird. And I can honestly say this is one of those moments in the books when I was just like, It's hard and shocking and disturbing, and it's even worse for the fact that you begin to recognize that Yuma is doing all of this apologizing, which is melting all these people's brains and faces and bodies, and then Chizumi's going to come in and lick it up. Because, yeah, that's a thing that she does. But if you look at these pages, there is at the forefront the gore and horror, the gore that we typically associate with the horror genre. And I'm not going to deny that body horror is a fundamental aspect of the genre. And in fact, for some horror stories, the entire appeal is the gore. It's the body horror, the fear of having your body destroyed or manipulated or damaged by some kind of outside force or individual. We don't like to imagine that somebody could hold us against our will and do something horrible to us, like cut off a limb or a body part, or torture us. Or, dare I say, even worse. One of the appeals of the torture porn genre after 9/11 was it managed to touch on that fear of something could happen to my body. A sadist could get control of my body and do something horrible to me. That was the appeal of the genre, and then it kind of spiraled out, like a lot of horror franchises do. But what's unique to me about this body horror is, again, yes, it's gross, and yes, we have this really, really beautifully drawn shot of this poor young man having his face melted. But at the same time, the cause of this destruction is really more the emphasis. Yuma is apologizing to these people, and apologies, socially speaking, are the ways that we build bridges. It's the way that we connect to one another when we have made fault. It's, again, that concern for empathy. Drifting Classroom, at least to my mind, is really an exploration of empathy and the way it can be manipulative, or more importantly, what can happen when people who have empathy are manipulated by people who don't. Yuma and Chizumi, again, are antisocial, they're psychotics, they're sociopaths who enjoy hurting people. One more so than the other, probably, but ultimately both of their efforts are to destroy the people around them for some ulterior motive. And especially with Yuma, at least to my mind, what's really horrific about this story is the fact that even to the very end, he's trying to apologize. And we recognize by this point in the story that this apology is not something of good intention. This story is ultimately a reflection of his interior darkness. Now, again, here's my thing. I don't like telling people, or I don't like the spoiler alerts, because it's stupid to me. I read stories because I want to see how the story is told, not because I want to hear what happens. But I know some people aren't like that. So, if you still haven't read Dissolving Classroom, that'll be a later video. If you haven't read Dissolving Classroom, I'm about to reveal something big. So, stop the video. You're gone? Okay. As we progress through the story, Yuma and Chizumi just harass one individual after another, leaving a wake of destruction and devastation in their wake. And the thing that I really wanted to bring attention to at the very end was some people be like, well, is it really the devil that's causing this magical power? Yes, it is. Probably my favorite page of this book is when the devil reveals himself to Keiko and says that he's going to take her to this big apology that Yuma is going to do on broadcasted television for millions of people all around the world. I love this book. I really love this book. And I've talked a lot now about, narratively why I think it's important, but I've also, I hope, explained why formally this book is really interesting. To me, Junji Ito is a master storyteller because he knows how to use the form. Predominantly, he's mostly using a lot of very intricate, very detailed line work that is absolutely stunning. And even if you're not a fan of horror, one of the appeals of his books to me is simply his art style. If we look at the last page of this first story, we see the shot where Keiko is running away from Yuma, terrified of what's going to happen to her when he apologizes. And if you look at this again, We see her, running from the classroom, seeing all of these dead bodies. We see Yuma chasing her down. This top page of the panel, we get her tripping and falling over, and then this beautiful long shot where we have Yuma reaching out to her, saying, I'm sorry, and we see the darkness that is emanating out of her. And if we just look at this one single panel here, its construction is really interesting. Again, these dark, bold lines are a way of sort of creating this demon-esque figure that's sort of emanating out of Yuma, revealing his antisocial behavior, just his sheer nastiness and evil, and of course, the devil himself. But at the same time, by using this long, almost full-page panel, Junji Ito is really able to sort of create a kind of climactic moment at the end of this story. I mean, at this moment, again, by using the panel layouts that he is, we are at sort of like the full force and energy of this horror climax. And you can see by all like the shadowing, these dramatic bold lines, the more and more emphasis on the destruction and dissolution of the body. It's all right there. But again, his line work alone is not what's really making this book. Because again, if you look at it too, look at the arrangements of the panels on the page. Where before, in the beginning, we had pretty sort of straight, consistent structure, okay? If we look at this page, or these two pages especially, for the most part, there's not a lot of experimental play with it. He's got, rows of 3, maybe rows of 4, and these are, for the most part, regularly squared and rectangle panels. But with the introduction of Chizumi, we begin to sort of note little things are beginning to happen. These top panels here, you'll observe, are smaller than the rest of the page, while the bottom panels stretch out all the way to the beginning. By making this top panel smaller, he's really emphasizing the moment in which Keiko sees Chizumi staring at her. And it's also that moment where we as the reader go, oh shit, get out. Again, though, formally speaking, it's by removing the space around these frames that this moment is really heightened. And then if we continue through the book, if we say, happen to take a moment, the scene where Chizumi attacks Keiko in the book, you'll note the previous page, we had a bunch of sort of standard square and rectangular panels. This sort of smoky line is leading us through the story. There's a nice sense of tension, coupled with the fact that he's using a lot of dark colors in the scene, where before Keiko had been kind of like in the light, out and about. These dark colors create a sense of tension. The smoky mist creates a sense of line. He's using a lot of visual, formal language to create this anxiousness in the reader that then you turn the page and Chizumi is waiting for you in this gorgeous half-page panel. And then these bottom panels, there's something like out of a nightmare. I could just keep going, just page after page after page of the dissolving classroom. Yes, of the dissolving classroom is just stunning. Because one of the things I like about Junji Ito, among all the other things I said I like about Junji Ito, is that he doesn't half-ass. This is a very, very careful approach. It may not be up to par of some of his other works, but the thing that's interesting about The Dissolving Classroom is the way that he takes the premise of empathetic people being, plagued by seemingly empathetic people, and telling a really great horror story while also managing to use the important formal elements of comics to tell a great story. So, if nothing else, Dissolving Classroom is yet another example of a great comic. And now I think I'm going to stop it here. We'll do the last hurrah and then call it a day. So, Dissolving Classroom by Junji Ito. What need more be said? This is a beautiful graphic novel. Well, beautiful in the sense that, formally speaking, in my mind, it's a great example of Junji Ito's ability as a cartoonist, as well as just the medium of comics being able to do something really effective and interesting. This book, while mostly at first glance being an interesting, or sort of just a sort of throwaway gag comic that's mostly just a lot of cheap body horror, if you really dig into it, like I noted before, is a really interesting exploration of empathy and the way that sociopaths and psychopaths in our society and culture can manipulate abuse and hurt empathetic individuals in ways that permanently destroy them. It's a way to sort of explore that reality, the reality that we don't want to acknowledge, and the fact that there are people out there that relish inflicting pain upon other people, and possibly the worst part, are seemingly oblivious to the pain in the first place, and in fact can make them seem as if they're the victims of their actual crimes themselves. The Dissolving Classroom is fun horror. It's great horror, and it's Junji Ito taking yet another one of his weird concepts and just running with it. And again, his ability to use the form of comics, his ability as just a master draftsman, really makes this yet another in a long line of wonderful books that, in my estimation, will seal his reputation as probably one of the, if not the most important horror cartoonists, if not important cartoonist period of his generation. The Dissolving Classroom is a great comic. Like, I've dedicated a half hour of your time and my time to it now, so please, take the time, read this book, you won't be sorry. Alright, I'm going to call it a day there. Thank you so much for watching, I really appreciate it. Thank you for indulging this dark room aesthetic. I may not do this again. I thought it would be something fun and interesting visually, but you know what? What can you do? So, please, 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 like, share, and subscribe, all that claptrap. It lets me know that you're liking the channel, that you want to see more. Please also remember as well, like I said at the start, there is a Patreon in the description section below. It's $1 a month. You can even just do a one-time donation of $1. It doesn't seem like a lot, but trust me, $1 from 100 people would be $100 a month, and that would help me buy paints, buy markers, buy comics. So, anything and everything you can give, I would be immensely appreciative. Now, when it comes to Dissolving Classroom, this is a standalone manga, which means if you're wanting a copy of this book, go to your local comic book shop and see if they've got a copy. Manga is really... There's more and more of a market from it, especially since the 1980s. American retailers are beginning to recognize that manga is kind of, you know, a thing, and that people, you know, like it. Who knew? Whatever the case, Junji Ito, especially being such a popular author, at least popular for nerds like me, I guarantee you your comic book shop can probably track down a copy of it if they don't have one on the shelves already. And trust me, go to your local comic book shop. Don't go to Amazon. Your local comic book shop is a lot cooler, damn it. Anyway, if they don't have it at your local comic book shop, don't forget you live in a world with public libraries. So go to your local public library, see if they've got a graphic novel / manga section. If they do, check it out. And if they don't, ask for an interlibrary loan form, and they can help you out. Again, Junji Ito being pretty popular, I really don't think you're going to have too much of an issue tracking down a copy of this book. So trust me, check out your comic book shop, check out your public library. Thank you so much for watching. I tremendously appreciate it, and of course, as always, go read some comics.